everyone. So today's topic of discussion is entry strategy and strategic alliances. And what are we going to learn today? We are going to learn what are the basic decisions a firm faces when it decides to go and enter a new foreign market. And there are different types of entry modes that a firm can use. So we are going to also discuss and compare these different types of entry modes, their pros and cons. And also, more specifically, we are going to touch a little bit on acquisitions and what are strategic alliances and what are their respective pros and cons so that we are aware of these issues. So first of all, whenever a firm decides to go global, let's suppose there is a domestic firm which is this might not be the first time it's going to a foreign market, but let's suppose it's just the first time. And there are three important questions that managers face. One, there's so many different countries in the world and there are so many different opportunities. Which market would give me best return on my investment? So which market should I enter? Once I've decided that, okay, out of these markets, let's say I'm focusing on these two markets to enter, next question is, when should I enter this market, right? Should I wait till some other firms have entered that market, or should I be the first one amongst all other global competitors to be in that market? And related to that question, timing of entry question is, on what scale should I enter? And finally, the final question is, should I export my product to that country, or should I just give license to some local company to make and market my product there? Or should I form a joint venture with a local partner to do business in that market? Or should I go and set up a wholly owned subsidiary? So these are different entry mode choices that a firm has. So all these three questions are really, really important, and they are linked with the strategy of a firm. So let's see, which market should we enter? We have discussed in our previous videos that we know that some markets are more favorable than other markets, simply because they have more stable political environment, more stable economic systems, more favorable government policies toward trade and FDI, and there's relatively low inflation rates, and of course there's low private sector debt. In addition to that, there are certain externalities that can help, that could be an advantage to do business, to establish a business there. For example, if that location has low-cost labor, it's a favorable market if I'm looking at somehow reducing my cost of production. So these are some of the variables which come to our mind when we look at markets and compare markets in terms of which market would be better to enter. In addition, competition is also important. For example, if you have a product which is new to that market and there is demand for that product, then of course it is a very, very attractive market to enter. Let's go to a second question, that is, when should we enter the market? Entry is considered early if the firm is the first or amongst the first ones to enter that foreign market as compared to other foreign competitors, whereas entry is considered late if there are already well-established foreign firms operating in that country. So there are both advantages and disadvantages of being an early mover or a latecomer in a market. Let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of early entry. So if a firm is an early entrant in a market, it can take, there are certain advantages known as first mover advantages. Because this is the first firm to enter this market, it will be able to capture the market fairly quickly, write down the experience curve, hence lower down its cost, and will create a brand equity which would be very difficult for other late entrants to break through. But if you look at the disadvantages, there are certain disadvantages of being a first mover. And when business environment of that foreign country is totally different from the home country of the business environment of the home country of that firm, then that firm is in a totally different, very, very difficult or different territory. And hence there could be certain costs which are known as pioneering costs related to not knowing to the environment, because of which you might make hefty mistakes leading to a lot of business failure. Or there could be other costs such as costs of establishing yourself in a new market as a foreign firm, and also educating the consumers regarding your product. So for example, KFC entered the Chinese market. It was the first American fast food chain which entered the Chinese market, and it had to deal with a lot of these issues, first mover disadvantages. It had to spend money, time and effort to teach or make Chinese consumers aware of what American fast food is, make them aware of the type of menu and the type of food that was available to them. And all this effort were actually easily captured by later entrants in the market, such as McDonald's. So for McDonald's, entry into China was easy because now the Chinese consumers were aware of American fast food. So McDonald's didn't have to actually spend a lot of money or effort in understanding the new market or educating the consumers. So here again, these are the advantages and disadvantages of being an early entrant. But if you are a late entrant, you are late in the game, the other firm is already established, brand reputation is there, it's very difficult for you to break through. So these are some of the disadvantages of being a late entrant. And related to the timing of entry is the question of scale of entry. When we talk of scale of entry, every firm should assess what is the strategic commitment that I'm willing to put in this market, and what will be its long-term impact on the firm. So, for example, ING, when it entered the US market, it's an insurance firm, when it entered the financial services market of the US, it spent billions of dollars, such as signaling huge strategic commitment in the US market. But the problem is that now that decision cannot be reversed, because once you have invested so much of money, it's not easy to pull out of the market. So this decision has a long-term impact on a firm's strategy. If you enter the market on a small scale, for example, Tesco, it's a huge retailer, a British retailer. When it entered the US market in, I think, mid-2000s, it entered on a small scale. In California, opening few stores, 1 or 2 stores, testing the market. So small scale entry signals low strategic commitment, but it is beneficial when you are entering a foreign market which is totally new, so you want to just get a feel of the market. Such that, okay, I have entered this market, I want to know about this market. Once I know, and if I see the potential of my business in this country, eventually I can increase my commitment by investing more in this market. Or if the business is not working fine, there is a flexibility that I can simply shut down the business or pull away from that market. So these are the issues revolving the scale of entry in a market, new market. Then finally, we have, once the firm has decided, okay, this is my target market, this is when I want to enter, and the third question is, how should I enter? So these are the 6 typical entry modes that we know of: exporting, turnkey projects, licensing, franchising, joint venture with a local firm, or establishing a wholly owned subsidiary, either through a greenfield investment or through an acquisition. So if you look at these 6 entry modes, they vary from each other in terms of the costs and risks involved, and also in terms of the benefits that they give to the firm that is investing in the foreign market. So let's look at them one by one. So if you look at exporting, we know what exporting is, right? There are certain advantages and disadvantages of exporting. For example, if a firm decides to export, it can simply manufacture the product in one or two global factories and then just sell them by exporting to different consumers in different parts of the world. And through that, it can achieve economies of scale and other location economies. But the problem is with exporting is that if you have a product such bulk products such as cement, it doesn't really make sense to export cement from US to China. Then the transportation costs are very, very high. So you cannot export cement. You have to make use of some other entry mode into the Chinese market. Similarly, whenever the trade barriers are very high, exporting becomes very difficult and costly. So exporting is not conducive under conditions of high trade barriers. And finally, there are certain issues which revolve around certain local agents which you give the contract to sell your product in that foreign market, and that agent might not be totally invested or might not be totally motivated to sell your product, because that agent might be carrying products of multiple companies. Then we look at turnkey arrangements. These are a little unheard of arrangements. These are very special type of contractual agreements between foreign firms and either local government or local firms, and these type of arrangements are very common in oil refining, metal refining, pharmaceutical, these kind of industries, wherein if a firm has certain production technology, and has the capability of creating and developing and building a fully functional site, then foreign firms, they go into taking up turnkey projects. And these projects make more sense when the host country government has strict regulations which inhibit foreign firm from doing FDI in that country. So for example, examples of turnkey projects could be a foreign firm which gets a contract from the local government of a country to build an airport, or to build a nuclear power plant, or to build a hospital. These are all different types of turnkey projects, wherein the foreign firm will just come in, design the full facility. Let's take the example of nuclear plant. It will design the plant, build the plan, make it fully functional, and even hire the employees, train them. And when the plant is fully functional, it will just hand over the key. That is why it is known as a turnkey project. Just hand over the key to the party which had given it this contract. And in return, the foreign firm gets a lump sum amount of money according to the contract. Why would foreign firms be interested in turnkey projects? That's a good question, because as I earlier mentioned, for example, in Middle East, foreign firms cannot enter the oil refinery industry. But these foreign firms, if they have this know-how of how to refine oil and how to establish an oil refinery, how can I make money out of this knowledge in this market when I know I cannot simply go and make my own oil refinery there? So instead of ignoring that market, I have this other option. I can help a local firm or get this contract from this local firm who doesn't know how to build an oil refinery. I'll just go take this contract, build the oil refinery for that local firm, hand over the key, and in turn I'll get some money out of my expertise. But the disadvantage of turnkey projects is a firm doesn't have any long-term interest in that market. Once you're done with the project, you get the money, you're just out of the market. So you don't get any constant revenue from your project there. And secondly, you may create a competitor. That is what happened with many foreign firms which went into turnkey projects in Middle East countries to make these oil refineries. Eventually, along with building up these oil refineries, they also passed on their technology to these local firms, and then now these local firms are competing with these US firms and European firms in the global market. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages of turnkey projects. Third important mode of entry is licensing. We have discussed a lot about licensing in previous lectures. And here again, I want to reiterate that licensing doesn't make sense when you have licensing doesn't make sense when you have certain proprietary knowledge which you think should not be shared with. Doesn't make sense when you need to have more control over the strategy, marketing, and pricing of your product, which won't be possible if you give the license to some other party to do all that work. And finally, but licensing is good when you want to avoid the costs of setting up your own operations in a foreign country just to sell your product. So instead of manufacturing my product in a foreign country by myself, I can simply license my technology or some intangible asset to a local firm to make that product, use the technology, make that product, sell, and instead, and in return, I'll just get a royalty fee out of it. So this suggests that licensing may not be appropriate or is not appropriate in high-tech industries. But in certain high-tech industries, firms have come up with novel ideas of using licensing agreements. Two important points here. One, there's something called cross-licensing agreements, wherein if you suppose there are two firms, A and B, in the pharmaceutical industry, firm A will give, let's say, a license to some intangible property to firm B, and in return of getting the royalty payment, firm A may say, okay, I have given you a license to use one of my technology. Why don't you in turn give me a license to use one of your technologies? If that happens, both parties, A and B, they are locked in. Both of them, they cannot misappropriate each other's technology for their own use, because they know if A misappropriates B's technology, B might also misappropriate A's technology. So there's one way of making licensing work in high-tech industries. Similar to that, there's another way licensing might work. For example, Starbucks, when it went to Japan, it wanted to maintain similar kind of services available to its Japanese consumers. And it was worried that if I just give a license or franchise to a Japanese firm, this might not be the quality of the services might not remain the same. So what it did was it formed a joint venture. Starbucks formed a joint venture with the local firm and gave the license to this joint venture instead of giving the license directly to a local firm. So these are some of the ways through which firms have been able to use licensing. Franchising is very similar to licensing. It's a specialized form of licensing where licensing is much more common in manufacturing industry. Franchising is more common in services industry. Here again, certain advantages and disadvantages. Franchising is a way of quickly or rapidly building your global presence, as has been seen in the case of McDonald's, Starbucks. They have simply occupied the world market by quickly giving different franchises to local firms or local people there. But the issue with franchising is, since it is usually common, it is common in services industry, and in service industry, quality of service is very important. One bad service experience can make the customer spill the beans to multiple parties. For example, if I have a bad experience in a hotel, and if it's a chain, worldwide chain, and I'm so unhappy with the services, I can just say, okay, to my friends and my colleagues, this is not a good hotel. And that can quickly escalate to many people. And services firms are really wary of such effect. They guard their quality or their reputation very strictly. So firms such as McDonald's, they have been able to come up with ways of how to deal with reputational effects or how to deal with poor quality services. So what McDonald's does is, in each of the major markets, it first establishes a either a joint venture with a local firm or a wholly owned subsidiary, and then it makes that subsidiary responsible for all the franchises in that particular market. So instead of headquarters dealing with all the franchises all across the world, it's these master franchises or master subsidiaries in each of the major markets which are responsible for all the franchises, for looking after the quality of all the franchises in their respective markets. So this is one way of firms using a combination of franchising and either with joint ventures or wholly owned subsidiaries to make things work. And this is a list of what we call top 10 global franchises. And as you can see, 9 of the top 10 are from the US. Topmost is your McDonald's, Subway, 7-Eleven, and so on and so forth. And coming up to our fifth type of entry mode is joint ventures. What are joint ventures? Joint ventures are nothing but when two firms come together to create a third firm. For example, Fuji and Xerox. You've heard of a firm known as Fuji Xerox. Fuji Xerox is a joint venture between Fuji, two different firms, Fuji and Xerox. Fuji and Xerox are different firms altogether. They have formed a joint venture which is known as Fuji Xerox, and each of these parent firms, Fuji and Xerox, they have 50-50 ownership in that joint venture, this new firm. And most of the joint ventures are actually 50-50 partnerships, but there are many joint ventures which can have unequal partnerships, such as 40-60 or 70-30, depending on the agreement between the two different firms. And as here again, advantages. Why would a firm want to form a joint venture with another firm, especially a local firm in that market? If you're going to a very, very different market, it really makes sense to form a joint venture with a local firm. So especially because this local firm has local markets knowledge, how to operate there. It is well versed with the political system, with the economic system. It will help you guide in the new environment. And by forming a joint venture, both firms are putting in certain resources, and hence the costs and risks are shared as compared to when a firm is going into the foreign market all by itself. But the problem with joint ventures is when you have two parties which are sharing management control as well as sharing the revenues and profits, initially the goals of the two parties might be the same, but after 2-3 years, when this foreign firm has become well versed with the ways of doing business in that country, it might not need the local partner anymore. So there could be a divergence of the goals between the two parties, which could create a lot of conflicts. So here's again, this is an example of an international joint venture. We are saying international joint venture because here two firms from two different nationalities are coming together, are forming a joint venture. Sony Ericsson is a very good example. Combines Sony's consumer electronics expertise with Ericsson's technological leadership, such that both Sony and Ericsson, they don't make any mobile phones. All the mobile phones are made by Sony Ericsson now. And finally, moving on to wholly owned subsidiaries. Wholly owned subsidiaries are the most expensive form of foreign entry, because essentially what it means is you are going and establishing a firm, your own subsidiary in that foreign market, all by yourself, without anyone's help. So all the money, all the resources that are going into building that subsidiary in that foreign market are all yours, and hence the risks are the highest. But the rewards are also also maximum, because you're not sharing the rewards with anyone, as was the case with the joint venture partnership. And there's no risk of losing your core competencies because you're not sharing it with anyone else. There you can have full control over that subsidiary. You have 100% ownership in that foreign firm. So you bear all the costs and risks. And wholly owned subsidiaries could be formed by two ways. Greenfield ventures, that is when you go into a foreign country, start from scratch. Take the permission from the government, buy land, build up the factory, everything. Or you can acquire a local firm and form a wholly owned subsidiary by fully dominating the ownership of that firm. So, if you look at all these 6 entry modes, all 6 entry modes, they have their advantages and disadvantages. And the most optimum entry mode would depend on the firm, and also on the market in which the firm is entering, the product it is making, and various other factors. In fact, 2 firms which are entering the same market at the same time may not even use the same entry mode. So, entry mode which is optimum for one firm may not be optimum for the other firm. And then let's move on to look at certain conditions under which we can safely say, okay, this entry mode makes more sense than the other ones. So one issue is the type of core competence that a firm has. So core competence is some competitive advantage of a firm which its competitors cannot copy. So when a firm's core competence is based on certain proprietary technological know-how, then we can safely say that licensing and even joint ventures, they are risky. You would most probably go for establishing a wholly owned subsidiary. But if your technological know-how is transitory in nature, such that you know that after 2 or 3 months, right now I have only I have this firm, but after 2-3 months, my rival firms are going to quickly catch up and also learn the same technology. Then I have a very short window of time in which to earn the maximum returns using that technology. Then I will go for giving licenses to different parties so that I can quickly earn profits. If I go with wholly owned subsidiaries, it might take me 3-4 months to even establish a firm, and it will take another 1 or 2 months to get it operational. So by that time, my competitive advantage would have been lost. Similarly, if you look at firms which have core competence in terms of managerial know-how, such as these services firms, you would say that franchising or licensing makes more sense here as compared to wholly owned subsidiaries, because even though wholly owned subsidiaries are the safest mode of entry and gives you the maximum return, but the costs are the highest. So essentially, if any firm has to balance the costs, benefits, and the risks of using these entry modes. Second, if you look at the type of pressures firms face in the global market, if a firm faces a huge cost reduction pressure, such as firms which follow global standardization strategy or transnational strategies, they need a lot of control over all their operations worldwide to be able to take care of or to take benefits from location economies as well as experience curve economies. And to have such control, you might have to rely on wholly owned subsidiary mode, because it is that wholly owned subsidiary mode gives a firm maximum control over its foreign operations. So I mentioned earlier that a firm can form a wholly owned subsidiary using a greenfield strategy or through an acquisition strategy. But out of these 2 strategies, which one will make more sense or which is better? That really depends on certain criteria, right? So wholly owned greenfield strategy makes more sense when you need to transfer, a firm needs to transfer its core competence, certain competencies, certain culture, certain routines to that foreign subsidiary. It's not easy to transfer these intangible things when you acquire a firm, because when you have acquired a firm, it already has some routines, it already has some culture. So it would be difficult to then override your own culture and routines on the existing ones. It is much more easier to establish a new firm from the baby stage and let the firm learn the routines and culture and core competence. That is much easier. But an acquisition strategy makes more sense when you have to quickly enter a market. You know that this is a very, very good opportunity. I should not miss it. And either there are already established foreign firms or the other rival firms are actually vying to enter this market. So when time is of essence, it is much better to go for acquiring a local firm, because if you go with a greenfield strategy, it will take a lot of time to establish it. So in terms of acquisitions versus greenfield, there's this notion managers think that acquisitions are less riskier than greenfield investments, because they believe that when you're acquiring some other local firm, you already know the history of the firm. You already know what assets it has. You already know that it has certain distribution systems, some loyal customers, and you just have to build on what is already there. You know that this has a constant stream of profits or revenues for the past so many years. Whereas when you establish a greenfield subsidiary, everything is new and risky. But research suggests that acquisitions, actually there's a very high failure rate of acquisitions. And you would be surprised to know that in some of the studies, almost the statistics are as high as 40%. 40% or 50% of acquisitions, they actually fail in some of the studies. So we should know why acquisitions fail. So I'm going to take up a very good example where Daimler acquired Chrysler in 1998. Daimler wanted to enter the US market, so it acquired Chrysler. But unfortunately, at that time, Daimler overpaid for that acquisition by almost 40%. When you overpay, you are already in a big mess. And around that time, the automobile industry was going to go through a slump. And that is what happened. Secondly, Daimler, Chrysler, they both originated from different countries, Germany versus US. Corporate cultures were very different. So when there were cultural clashes in between the managers of these firms, so it was not easy to merge both the sides of the businesses. And finally, there were also problems related to integration issues. Daimler took a lot of time creating integration plans, and by the time the plans were up, the time was already gone by, and Chrysler was also already making huge losses. So these are certain reasons why acquisitions actually fail, and research suggests that whenever a firm wants to acquire a new firm, there are three important steps that they should take. One, they should study the target firm very, very minutely so that there are no surprises later on. Second, they should also look at what is the corporate culture, whether my corporate culture or that corporate culture will be able to merge with my corporate culture or not. And finally, if you acquire a firm, have an integration plan ready so that you quickly implement it. Do not wait for multiple years, because what happened with Daimler Chrysler could happen to any other firm. So last topic of our discussion is strategic alliances. Very important means of entering a market. Strategic alliances are cooperative agreements between actual or potential competitors, and they can range from contractual agreements such that two firms sign a contract to develop a product together, or they could be they could either also be equity strategic alliances, such as what we have discussed in terms of joint ventures. And there are various advantages and disadvantages of strategic alliances that you should be aware of. First advantage is strategic alliances, alliance with a local firm can help you enter a new market, will help you share the costs and risks. as compared to if you go do it alone, if you enter the market alone. For example, Warner Brothers, they wanted to expand their business in China, and they figured out that there would be a lot of governmental issues in terms of getting certain contracts and paperwork if they do it alone, if they enter the Chinese market alone. So they formed a joint venture with two Chinese firms, which facilitated their entry into the Chinese market and helped Warner Brothers to distribute its content in the Chinese market. Other potential advantages could be strategic alliances could be a way of bringing together complementary assets and hence making something which could not be some product or some technology couldn't have been possible without the coming together these complementary assets or technologies. But the disadvantage of strategic alliances, as we have discussed with joint ventures, is there's always a risk of your partner misappropriating your knowledge, whatever you are sharing. And if you are sharing certain proprietary technology, then the risks are much, much higher. And it is also believed that sometimes firms end up sharing more than they receive from a strategic alliance. Although there are ways through which strategic alliances could be designed, wherein firm can block the other firm in gaining access to certain parts of its business. That is what Boeing did with its Japanese partners. Boeing shares the production of its jet planes, but doesn't share the marketing and the R&D work that it does on its products with the Japanese partners. So there are certain ways through which strategic alliances could be built in a way that firms can actually safeguard against leaking of their proprietary technology. So, what have we learned today? We now know what if today I have to make a decision as a CEO of a firm. I know that these are the basic 3 decisions that I need to specifically look. I need to find a market or where I should make the investment. I need to look when should I make that investment, and also need to look at which entry mode would be most optimum for me to enter that market. We also discussed specifically compared greenfield ventures with acquisitions and discussed the pros and cons of these 2 strategies. And also later on we also discussed what are the advantages and disadvantages of using strategic alliances. And with that, that's it for today. Thank you.